Hi, friends. Welcome to a place for thoughtful conversations about baking, fermentation, grain, and the people keeping the craft alive. I'm Allison White, and this is Saving Bread. Welcome to the first real episode of Saving Bread. Before we get into today's topic, I want to give you a quick idea of how this podcast will be organized because you may be here for different reasons. You may be here to learn specific baking terms and skills. You may be waiting for interviews with bakers, authors, farmers, and millers. Or maybe you are here because you just love bread and you want to hang out in this world for a little while. So episodes will fall into three general categories. Lessons. Lessons are deeper dives into specific topics like sourdough starter, flour, types of wheat, milling, pH, fermentation, and practical skills that make bread feel less mysterious. Interviews. Conversations with fellow bakers, authors, farmers, millers, teachers, and other wonderful people in this community. And the third one, breadcrumbs. This is kind of the catch-all category. It could be Q&As, bakery tours, bake-alongs, random bread thoughts, chats between me and my friends or customers. Leah will definitely be very involved in these specific episodes. These could be on-site conversations, basically anything that doesn't clearly fit into the lessons or interviews categories will be put here in breadcrumbs. Today's episode is a lesson on basic sourdough starter care and maintenance. And you might be thinking, well, I already know how to keep a sourdough starter alive. And that's great. But there's many people who do not. And I bet each of us can think of at least 5 friends who want to make sourdough but struggle with the idea of keeping a starter alive. So go ahead and send them this episode to use as a tool. Or maybe you're a baker and you give starter away at the market, but you don't have the time or the energy to explain to everyone how to care for it. Just tell them about the Saving Bread podcast and they will be in good hands, I promise. So let's get into it. Today, we are talking about sourdough starter, which feels like the right place to begin this series because this is where a lot of people get intimidated. Starter is often the one thing that makes people either overcomplicate sourdough baking or quit before they really even give it a chance. I cannot tell you how many messages I get that are basically, did I kill my starter? Why does it smell weird? Do I really need to feed this every 12 hours? I forgot about it for 3 days. Is it dead? And I get it. There's so much information out there about starter maintenance, and a lot of it sounds conflicting. And so it can be really hard to know what actually matters. So I want us to relax a little bit and just simplify this. We are going to talk about what starter actually is, how to keep one alive in a way that works for your life, and some of the biggest myths or mistakes that confuse people. First, what is a sourdough starter? A starter is basically a little ecosystem in a jar. Inside of that jar, you have flour, water, wild yeast, lactic acid bacteria, enzymes, and other naturally occurring microorganisms all interacting with one another. We will do a deeper dive into sourdough microbiology in a future episode. But for today, I want to keep the basic concept very simple. What's happening inside of that jar is called fermentation. When you mix flour and water together, naturally occurring microbes begin feeding on the carbohydrates in the flour. As they feed, they create byproducts. The yeast produce carbon dioxide gas, which helps create lift, and the bacteria produce acids, which help acidify the culture and later the dough. Together, they create the flavor, aroma, strength, and leavening power we associate with sourdough. So in the simplest terms, yeast help create gas and lift. Bacteria help create acidity and flavor. Flour is the food source, and water hydrates the flour and allows the whole system to function. Both the yeast and the bacteria need to be working together in a healthy balance if you want to bake consistently good bread. That is the big picture. You do not need magic flour. You do not need a fancy jar. Sourdough baking requires flour, water, time, observation, and consistency. Now let's talk about starter care and maintenance, because this is where people often feel like sourdough becomes much more complicated than it needs to be. I want to start from square one and set a baseline vocabulary so that later when we talk about things like stiff starters, liquid levain, flour swaps, hydration, pH, and different maintenance schedules, everyone is on the same page. I come from a science background where we need controls and variables to make sure we understand when changes are affecting our dough. So for the sake of this episode, let's assume someone gives you a healthy, active starter, or maybe you ordered one online. I personally bought mine from King Arthur about 5 years ago, but most local sourdough bakers or bakeries are usually happy to share some. We can talk about making a sourdough starter from scratch on another episode. But for now, if you're brand new, I would say find a baker friend and ask for starter. So once you have a starter in hand, you need to decide what flour you want to feed it. Again, for beginners and for the sake of creating a consistent baseline for this podcast, I like a blend of 50% bread flour and 50% whole wheat flour. When I say bread flour, I mean a white flour, somewhere around 11.5 to 13% protein. When I say whole wheat, any hard red whole wheat flour is a good place to start. Most grocery stores carry something like King Arthur whole wheat flour or something similar. The reason I like bread flour and whole wheat flour as a blend is because the bread flour gives you a little stability while the whole wheat brings more nutrients that can help support fermentation and activity. It's better food for the microbes in your jar. Now let's talk about feeding ratios. A sourdough starter feeding has 3 parts: old starter, flour, and water. If all 3 parts are equal by weight, we call that a 1:1:1 feeding ratio. In other words, for every 1 gram of starter, you have 1 gram of flour and 1 gram of water. If you scale that up, that could look like 20 grams of starter, 20 grams of flour, and 20 grams of water. Or it could be 100 grams of starter, 100 grams of flour, and 100 grams of water. The total amount can change, but the relationship between the 3 parts stays the same. If we change that feeding ratio to 1:5:5, that means you have 1 part starter, 5 parts flour, and 5 parts water. For example, if we have 10 grams of starter in a jar, we would add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water because 10 times 5 is 50. If we had 20 grams of starter, we would add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water because 20 times 5 is 100. These are feeding ratios and they matter because they control how much fresh food you are giving the microorganisms. The more fresh flour and water you give the starter relative to the amount of old starter, the longer it can generally go before it needs to be fed again. Timing, of course, will still depend on temperature, flour type, hydration, the condition of your starter. So I want you to hear these timing examples as guidelines, not rigid rules. For this episode, let's assume that your starter is being kept at room temperature, around 75 degrees. At a 1:1:1, your starter may need to be fed again within a few hours. At 1:5:5, your starter may last closer to a daytime or an overnight window before needing to be fed again. If we bump that up at a 1:10:10 or a 1:15:15, your starter may last longer before it peaks and begins to fall. The point is not that these are exact timings. The point is that the larger feed gives the starter more fresh flour to work through, so it buys you more time between feeds. Think of it like this. If you were starving and you ate 1 apple, you would probably be hungry again very soon. But if you ate a Thanksgiving dinner with turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, gravy, pumpkin pie, whipped cream, you probably would not need food again for quite a while. Starter is not a person, but the analogy helps. More food usually means a longer time before the culture is hungry again. Now let's walk through the process so you know exactly what to do. Remember our controls. We have a container of flour that is 50% bread flour and 50% whole wheat flour. We have room temperature water, around 75 degrees Fahrenheit. We have a healthy sourdough starter that someone gave us, or that we ordered online. We are keeping the starter at room temperature, 75, maybe 77 degrees Fahrenheit, and we are going to feed at a 1:5:5 ratio. First thing in the morning, get a clean container and choose something big enough for the starter to double or even triple in size. Put the clean container on your scale and tear the weight to 0. Inside of that container, you will put 20 grams of starter, 100 grams of flour, and 100 grams of water. Make sure that water is room temperature. Mix it well. A side note and a small tip, I like to add the water first, then the starter, and mix those together. Then I add the flour, but don't stress about the order too much. The most important thing is that everything is mixed thoroughly and there's no dry pockets of flour. Once it's mixed, cover the container. I like a deli container with a lid, but I don't want people to panic about the lid. The goal is to protect the starter from drying out or collecting debris. You do not need a fancy jar and you do not need to leave it wide open. Just use a clean container and a lid that is secure. Once your starter is fed and in the jar with the lid on, leave it on the countertop. If your countertop is very cold because it's stone or marble or something like that, place the starter somewhere warmer, like on a wooden cutting board, a shelf, or another spot in your kitchen that holds a more stable temperature. That's it. In the evening, come back and look at the container. Ideally, it has risen significantly. It may have doubled, it may have tripled. It may be domed at the top or just starting to sink. You're going to take a new clean container, put it on your scale, and tear it to 0. Then take 20 grams of starter from the container that has been sitting on the counter all day and place it into the new clean container. Add 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water. Mix well, cover, and leave on the counter overnight. In the morning, repeat the process, and then again in the evening, and so on. I like feeding into a clean container because it keeps the sides of the jar clean and lowers the chance of dried starter building up around the rim. You can keep a little extra in the fridge as a backup if it makes you feel better, but please hear me, you do not need to keep a huge jar or multiple jars of discard in your refrigerator unless you plan on using them. Start to feel comfortable composting any extra that's left over from the previous jar. Now let's talk about what we're looking for during the life cycle of a sourdough feed. Right after mixing, the starter will look low in the jar and may look shaggy or paste-like. Over the next several hours, it should begin to bubble and rise. It will rise as much as it can before it eventually begins to weaken and fall back down. This is where you will hear the term peak. Peak simply means the starter has risen as much as it can before it begins to collapse. You will hear bakers say, feed at peak, mix dough at peak. Use your starter when it's active and bubbly. Personally, I often like mixing my dough or feeding my starter just after peak. When the starter is barely beginning to sink back down, at that point, it's active, it's lightly acidic, and it's ready to go to work inside of my dough. When you open the container just after peak, the starter should smell pleasantly fermented. It might smell a little bit sour, a little bit creamy, yeasty, fruity, or even just a little tangy. It should not smell putrid or rotten. If it smells strongly like vinegar, alcohol, or acetone, that usually means it's gone longer than ideal without food. It doesn't automatically mean it's unsafe or anything like that, but it's telling you that it is hungry and it's often in need of one or more refreshments. Here's the part that gets slightly tricky, and this is where people can get confused, so I want to be very clear. Your house may be warmer or cooler than mine. Your flour may behave differently than mine. Your starter may move faster or slower than mine. You may find that after 12 hours at our 1:5:5 ratio, your starter has risen and fallen all the way back down to the bottom of your jar. If that's happening consistently, your starter is probably moving through its food too quickly for your schedule. The solution is to give it a larger feed, such as a 1:7:7, a 1:10:10, or even 1:15:15. Anything that can take you all the way through approximately 12 hours between feeds when you open the jar and you're catching it just after peak. You may also find the opposite is true. After 12 hours, your starter has barely risen. In that case, Your house may be too cold for optimal starter care, or the starter just may need more time, or it may need a few consistent refreshments to build strength, or perhaps you're giving it too much food. For the first couple of weeks, I want you to be a detective. Watch the rise and fall, smell it, notice how long it takes to peak, take notes, take pictures. Once you find a rhythm that works for your home, your flour, and your life, then you can just stick with it. And a note, you may need to adjust seasonally. A starter that behaves perfectly in the spring may move much faster in August, and that is normal. In the warm summer months, I often need a much larger feed, sometimes around 1 to 15 to keep my starter happy and on a 12-hour schedule. For example, that could be 10 grams of starter, 150 grams of flour, and 150 grams of water. You do not need to maintain that much starter unless you plan on using it, so you can always scale the same ratio down. Then your starter is consistently sluggish. A temperature-controlled proofing box like a Broden Taylor can be really helpful, but you don't need to buy one to begin. Start with observation first. If you are brand new to starter care, I recommend keeping your starter on the counter for at least 2 weeks so you can learn its behavior. That does not mean you have to keep it on the counter forever. It just gives you time to understand what healthy activity looks like and smells like before you move it into a slower, colder environment. Once you understand your starter, you can absolutely keep it in the refrigerator. And I do that too. A good time to put it into the fridge is at peak or just after peak. In other words, after it has risen well and it is active, you can close the container tightly and refrigerate it. The refrigerator slows everything down. It does not stop fermentation completely, but it slows it enough so that you do not have to feed the starter twice a day. How long can it stay in there? Well, that depends on the health of your starter and your tolerance for reviving it. If you bake weekly, a refrigerated starter routine is very manageable. If it sits for a couple of weeks, it's likely going to need more refreshments before baking. If it sits much longer, it may still be recoverable as long as there's no mold or pink or orange streaking or rotten smell, but it may take more feedings, more refreshments to bring it back up to strength. Personally, I like to do about 3 refreshments before mixing dough. So if I'm mixing dough Saturday morning, for example, I might take my starter out of the fridge Thursday night, feed it Thursday night, Friday morning, and Friday night, and then I will mix when I wake up on Saturday morning. That first feed from the fridge may benefit from slightly warmer water, especially if the starter is very cold or sluggish. Once it's reliably doubling or tripling within a reasonable window, it's likely ready to bake with. Once I pull out what I need for my dough, I can continue with feeds or close the container and return it to the refrigerator until I need it again, knowing though that it will need refreshments from the fridge when I come back to it. And that's about it. It's really that simple. More than anything, it takes practice, putting in the reps, and observing the starter's behavior. As long as you're keeping a few controls like room temperature water, the same type of flour, and the same ratios each time, you will learn the behavior of your starter. Okay, I have Leah here to do our Q&A, our first Q&A for the Saving Bread podcast. Leah, thank you for being here today.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm really happy to be here to help you with this podcast journey. Excited to start.
So exciting. Okay, can you read some of the questions that came in from our listeners, and we will go through them one by one.
Yeah. All right, let's get started. So question number 1, do I need filtered water to feed my starter?
I love this question, and I get this one a lot. Usually, no. Most tap water works fine. If your water is heavily chlorinated, smells really strong of chlorine, or you're on well water with quality concerns or something like that, then filtered water may be helpful, but most people do not need special water. The bigger variables are consistent feeding, clean containers, flour choice, and temperature.
Okay, awesome. Okay, we'll move right on to the second question. What are your signs that my starter is in poor health?
Okay, great. A starter that is struggling may smell very sharply alcoholic or like vinegar or acetone. It may have hooch, which is a liquid layer on top it's kind of like a gray color, and that usually means that it's hungry. It might stop rising well, or it may take many hours to show activity. And all of those would be signs that it's in need of refreshments and in need of a more consistent feeding routine. And those signs are different from contamination. If you see like fuzzy pink mold or pink streaks or orange or really, really rotten smell, just discard the starter and start over with a clean container. That's about it.
Okay, that's interesting. I thought the gray on the top was actually bad, so I think I threw the whole thing away.
Right.
But I've definitely seen where it transitions into like orange streaks where I thought, oh
Yeah.
no, this is definitely no longer viable and I have to
Correct.
throw it away.
Taste
okay. All right. Next question. What is the biggest mistake people make when feeding their starter?
The biggest mistake, probably one of the biggest mistakes people make when feeding their starter is allowing compounded acidity to build up. So what I mean by that is if your starter is very healthy and you're maintaining it consistently, one missed feed or using your starter once it's a little bit too mature to make your dough is really not a big deal at all. But if you're consistently waiting too long between feeds, the starter can become increasingly acidic and sluggish. And that can lead to weaker fermentation, overly sour aromas, and bread that does not, or dough that does not behave the way that you want it to. So I think this is where the fridge can be very useful. If the twice a day feeding feels too much for maintenance, popping it into the refrigerator so you can have a break in between dough days is a really great tool for a lot of people.
Okay, and so when you miss, like how many feeds would you say if you missed would be like detrimental to the starter?
I think the longer you go between feeds, the more refreshments you will need to get it back up. If you miss one, maybe it's not the end of the world. If you miss two, again, couple feeds, it'll be back. But if you forget about it for a few days, you might be looking at a week of refreshments of morning and night, or several during a couple of days back to back to back to get it back up to strength. So the longer it goes between feeds, the more refreshments it might need to get back to optimal health.
Got it. That's interesting. Okay, I didn't really think about it in that way. I would have assumed that you could just kind of maybe go a couple more times, the starter would be fine, and then you move on. But okay, that makes sense. Okay. Yeah. Can I freeze or dehydrate my starter?
So this was an interesting one because I didn't actually know the answer to this question because it's not something that I had done before. So I thought about it and looked through some of my books, and I'll definitely reference some of my favorite books at the bottom of the show notes for this podcast. But yes, you can do both freezing and dehydrating as probably like worst case scenario backup plans or insurance policies, not something you necessarily need to do, but it's nice to have if you really love your starter and you just want that backup. Let's start with freezing. So you can freeze a starter, and it's just important to know that some of the microbes may not survive being frozen, but many will go dormant. And so once they are thawed and fed again, the surviving yeast and bacteria will multiply and rebuild the culture. But it could just take quite a few refreshments before it's strong and active enough to bake with. And then as far as dehydrating, this might be the one that I would lean towards more. To dehydrate a starter, you just feed it, let it become active, spread it into a thin layer on parchment paper or a silicone mat, and let it dry until it's completely brittle, and then just break it apart into flakes, and then store that in an airtight container. And then when you want to use it again, you just add water and begin feeding it like normal. So don't panic if it's not doubling immediately. It might take a few refreshments to wake it back up. But I don't think it's going to kill your starter. I don't know if it's the best way to keep it though. I personally prefer the refrigerator, and I think it's really helpful and useful. But if you really feel like you need that backup emergency, or maybe you're giving starter away, then dehydrating might be the best way to go.
And when you were looking at researching freezing it, how do people end up freezing it? Because I know like the thin layer you just talked about, but how do they take a chunk? What does that look like?
You know, I didn't really find a lot of people doing this. I feel like it's probably not the most popular way. If I was going to do it, because I didn't find a ton of resources on freezing it, just, you know, best guess would be that, or how I would do it is I think I would put it into little ice cube trays and freeze it as ice cubes, and just have a bag of starter ice cubes and kind of go from there. That would be an experiment for science and maybe something we can do. for the pod and try reviving it as a
yeah,
project.
I mean,
for us.
when I read freezing it, I thought, oh, I didn't really think about that because I only hear about refrigerating it and dehydrating it, but I had not heard about freezing it. So I'm like, what format do you freeze it? But I think that makes sense. Like little chunks of it and do it that way.
Let's do it and see what happens, and we can report back to our listeners.
I'm so excited.
We'll do it for science.
Science, yes. And we can provide everybody all of the experiments.
The juicy deets. Yes. Okay. Well, you're amazing. Thank you for reading these listener questions, and you will be doing this regularly for us.
I'm so excited. Okay. Well, listener questions are through right now Instagram, right?
That's right.
If you see Ali post about that, please submit your questions and we will get them onto the podcast with our wonderful answers and maybe experiments to come.
That's right. All right.
Cool.
Bye, Leah.
Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Saving Bread podcast. I'm Allison White, and on our next Lessons episode, we will be diving a little deeper into intermediate starter care and troubleshooting. Music by Joshua Grange from Dope. Until next time, happy baking, and as always, long live real bread.